without a police force. Prisons are also not the oldest institution in the world, so you can imagine it without that. And so ultimately what the government is it's that institution which holds it holds political authority, by which I mean a unique ability to use violence in ways that is not that would not be acceptable if it came from like a normal person in the population. The reason that the police force are a part of the government is because they can use violence in ways that would not be acceptable if it was done by another person. And I don't just mean instances of abuse, but I mean that they're acting out on laws that we would not accept from anyone else. For example, if I wanted to go round someone up because they were using drugs that I didn't like them to do, I could not do that. But because government has kind of a unique leeway on the amount of violence we accept from them, that is something that we do. And so obviously the reason that most people would say that we need a government is because, of course, whether or not there's one institution that's uniquely able to use violence, people are still going to be using violence. And you want to be able to protect people so they don't have their rights violated. You don't want like a Mad Max scenario. You don't want a Hobbesian war of all against all. So rightly, I think most people's solution to this is, well, you need a neutral third party. But what I think that the leap goes to is in assuming that everyone in all cases needs to use the same neutral third party, and which means setting up a government. Instead, what the anarchist proposal, or at least the kinds of anarchism that people in libertarian circles are likely to be familiar with, the solution is that there can be alternative methods of dispute resolution and alternative methods of providing security through either market setting or just more general like community, like civil society. And it's important to note, I think, that it's not as if this is completely new idea, because already there's quite a bit of private arbitration between in legal disputes. From what I understand, private arbitration is actually a larger industry than like the court system, the government court system itself. What this would be doing is removing the smaller portion, the government court system, and treating all disputes as cases needing private arbitration, and then these would be enforced by groups that have that are certainly entitled to use defensive force, and part of that means being able to enforce the rulings of a legal decision. But what makes them different from the police is that they do not have a unique right that is not shared by everyone else. And part of the reason that this is important is the same reasons that most of us know from our understanding of the United States Constitution and ideas of the founders, that you need checks and balances. The only difference here is that we're carrying the idea of checks and balances a step further, because the checks and balances that we have within the United States government are just checks and balances within the same organization. And this is much more radical sort of checks and balances where there's checks and balances in the sense of that the different parts of the legal system are actually different organizations altogether, and that they are subject to the same legal sanctions as everyone else. But anyway, I think I'm getting a little bit off track here. So a good way of looking at this is, so a lot of people's problem is that they assume that if you don't have like a single security system of security, then law enforcement, then you're going to have basically private security agencies battling in the streets. This is basically Ayn Rand's reason for not being an anarchist. It's most people's, within libertarian communities, immediate, intuitive reason for not being, for not accepting anarchism. And the reason that this is almost certainly wrong, there are more nuanced critiques of anarchism that I think are interesting, but I think this one I'm very confident is false. And that's because, among other things, the fact that this is everyone's immediate intuitive reaction, I think shows that it's not one that we desire. And because it's not one that people desire, they're not going to want to resort to that kind of violence, except in situations that are very extreme. And beyond that, when we're talking about private security agencies, this violence is not only stupid, it's also stupid financially. It costs quite a bit. So if you're a private security agency, you're not going to want to go to war over someone's stolen television. And so there's typically going to be prearranged agreements about going to private arbitration, and so on and so forth. And finally, even beyond all that, it's not as if there's no precedent for this. Of course, there's no place in history that I would say perfectly fits all of the market anarchist or individualist anarchist model in every way, but I would say that every feature of it has been tried and historically, and typically tends to be very successful. The most common example people point to, I think, is the Icelandic Free State, which was in place in Iceland in the Middle Ages for, I think, about 200 years. And that was a system which is probably the most minimal government imaginable, because it did not have a state police force. It did not have military, it did not have government services really of any kind, except for that they limited the number of people who could provide security service, law enforcement services, and and who could do dispute resolution. And they basically had a government that met every few years to agree on what the laws were. But certainly it seems like if you can do that and it was relatively peaceful, then it's likely that could be that you could do away with the limiting of the number of law enforcement providers. Mm-hmm. So that might have been a little bit more kind of all over the place than I intended. So if there's anything that I need to talk more about, feel free to let me know.
No, you're doing fine. I was going to ask what historically about the societies that have kind of emulated anarchic ideas, and I think I have heard the Iceland references before. Are there any others you can think of? Because I thought I had heard of some others, and off the top of my head, I can't
certainly. So, I mean, there's obviously it's going to be. It's once again, like I said, it's not like there's one place. It's like, oh, this is perfect in every way. This is market anarchy. Obviously, that's not the case. But there are a lot. Obviously, there have been countries that have survived without a standing army. There have been, like I said, the police force is a relatively recent invention, and so places have existed without police for long periods of time. Same with the prison system. But in terms of the really interesting cases, Iceland, I think, is the one most commonly pointed to, but also pre-conquest Ireland is really interesting because it also had a large, from what I understand, not as much as medieval Iceland, but medieval Ireland also had large amounts of private arbitration for what was effectively private arbitration for things that we think of as criminal cases today, and that to an even lesser extent than Ireland, but still to a significant degree, this is the case in England at one point in the developing of the common law, and that there was also the law merchant, which was the way in which financial transactions were handled over large areas before the rise of like international law and things like that. And the law merchant was basically a system of legal of law and dispute resolution between merchants across Europe that did not rely on interestingly, and I don't think this is something that would be necessary, but did not rely on violence at all. And because the way in which that worked was basically, if I remember correctly, there were dispute resolutions that ended in people kind of just peacefully disassociating from people who had bad dealings. And I mean, there's a very obvious parallel here in modern times with the sorts of systems that on online services with rating systems, that if people get screwed over, they just give people bad ratings, and that is how a lot of financial transactions on the internet work. And for more modern examples, a couple that are interesting is I'm just alluding to a lot of internet financial interactions, especially with things that are actually explicitly illegal. Before it was taken down, the Silk Road, which was an online black market that mostly is where people would buy things like drugs, which is obviously not the safest industry in the world to be dealing with, but it was on this because it allowed for kind of these rating systems in which people are able to dissociate from people that screwed them over. And then more significantly than that, in terms of dealing with like really heinous types of crimes, there's also something that a lot of people like to say to anarchists or even just more normal libertarians when they're not being very serious is basically like, well, why don't you go live in Somalia and see how you like it there?
I hear that a lot.
Yes, exactly. And so Somalia is a really interesting case because from what I understand, it's kind of a mistake to talk about Somalia as like one big place, because there's a lot of differentiation and variation between particular areas of Somalia. And particular areas of Somalia certainly are just chaotic and just fairly good examples that we think of a failed state. And usually, from what I've heard, I mean, this might be different now. I remember reading this a few years ago. Most of the stuff that I've read about Somalia was a few years ago, so this might be different now. But the places where it's most chaotic and where there's most like warlord activity are the places that are the more urban areas, and that they're also the places that where the government already had the most control over before the collapse of the Somalian state. And that much of the problem there is because it's a whole lot of people basically trying to become the new Somalian state, or at least a state over like a particular area. Mm-hmm. Whereas the more rural areas have an entirely non-state legal system. And I'm not sure how to pronounce it because I've always said Zir, but someone corrected me once and said that it was hair. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go ahead and say Zir because that's how I prefer to pronounce it. And an interesting thing about Zir, and it's an interesting thing about a lot of the different kinds of systems I've been mentioning, is that Zir treats all crimes as cases of some sort of basically a property rights violation, and crimes against people's person, once again, are property rights violations because you're infringing on that person's like bodily integrity or against their rights to their person. And because they treat them all as property rights violations, They're not viewed as in the way that we typically